This is verse 23 of the 16th chapter of the Gospel of John. Jesus giving instruction and indeed encouragement to his disciples with respect to the fact that though they won't see him for a brief time, they will see him, of course, from then on. And their sorrow that they'll feel immediately will be transformed into joy. And he does give the impression, at least, that that continuing and ongoing state of joy will continue for indefinitely, that there's no end in sight. And so while the sorrow may last for a moment, the joy is going to be something that will continue indefinitely into the future. And Jesus, now speaking of that situation, says kai, the connective in. The preposition takes the dative in akene, demonstrative pronoun. It means that. This is the feminine singular dative of the pronoun. So in that, te, the article, which is idiomatically included with the demonstrative pronoun in akene te hemera, in that day. Hemera, a word from which we get the word ephemeral, the idea of something lasting for a day. It's a way to remember it, but in that day, Jesus says, me, putting it up front and emphatic, so that it gets the degree of attention that it deserves. And then a rather surprising thing he says, me, uk, the negation, erotesita. From erotao, it means to ask. This is the future now, second person plural, future active indicative. In that day, not you will ask nothing. So in that day, you're not going to ask me for anything. Maybe a little bit of an overstatement, but the point, of course, is to say that now any barrier, you might say, that would separate the worshiper from God the Father, from the God of the universe, is now going to be set aside. Christ has been here as a human being, and you might say the access of the disciples to God has been through Christ. And even though we understand perfectly well that Christ is God among us, nevertheless the humanity of Christ was something that more or less stood as a kind of intermediate connection there, in a sense separating the disciples from the Father. But Jesus has just said to them, now, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. And in some ways, the whole drift of this is to make it clear that the immediate access of the disciples is to the Father. So, amen, amen. Adding emphasis to it, lego, first person singular, present active indicative, I say, humen, indirect object, the dative plural of the second person pronoun, truly I say to you, on, short for eon, te, and taken together, it's the idea of whatever you should, and then the idea aitesita. This is in the subjunctive now. The on here takes the subjunctive. So whatsoever you ask, second person plural, it's the aorist active subjunctive. Whatever you ask, tone patera, whatever you ask the Father, in preposition with the dative to anomati mu, in the name of me. Whatever you ask the Father in my name, dose. This is from didomi, I give. This is the third person singular future active indicative. He will give humen to you. The pronoun in the dative plural, second person. So in that day, you're not going to ask me for things as you have been up until this point. Really, the distinction is now between the situation of the disciples as it has been occurring up until this point and the transformation that will take place with the resurrection and ascension of Christ, in which you might say the door is opened, the access into the very presence of God. The veil is rent, as it were, and now the disciples and all Christian people with them are given the opportunity to pray directly to God through the intermediary of the person of Christ.